Well, joining me here in Washington to talk about all this is Scott Winship. He studies living standards and economic mobility, inequality and insecurity. He does that at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. And from Austin, Texas, economist and professor of government, James Galbraith. His latest book, The End of Normal, The Great Crisis and the Future of Growth, examines the after effects of the 2008 recession. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. Dr. Galbraith, let me start with you with a simple question. What is income inequality? I mean, people have earned different salaries for doing different things, but what's changed now?
A simple question that does not have a simple answer. Inequality, of course, is a feature, it's a fact of life. What troubles us is when it grows too rapidly, when it distorts the structure of power in society. You know, long ago, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, a great sentence I always quote, wrote, "Wealth is power, as Mr. Hobbes says." And that is, of course, an important question. Do we have a society in which all of the citizens have some reasonable chance to participate in its governance and decision-making? That's a major consequence of rising income inequality, is that, in fact, we do not.
Dr. Winship, some important points raised there. Does income inequality actually translate into political inequality, social inequality? Does it undermine a person's ability to move upward?
Well, obviously, those are the most important questions to ask. And I think, like most Americans, and most rich Americans, I would say, I'm concerned about inequality of opportunity. And I think it's worth distinguishing that from income inequality. When you look at what has been done in academic research on inequality's effects, whether it's effects on economic growth, on middle-class incomes, financial stability, or democracy and sort of political inequality, the evidence just is not that strong that we ought to, if we wanted to engage a war on inequality, it's not the evidence that you would want to use to make the case for war. The most recent research that I've seen actually shows that policy preferences between rich, middle class, and poor actually don't vary by all that much. They tend to differ a lot less than what we would think. And a lot of the research that looks at inequality and political outcomes relies on developing countries, which is just a very different context than the United States and its affluent peers.
Dr. Galbraith, do you buy that people's views on policy when it comes to income inequality are very much the same? Because the conventional view is that, you know, you hear from people who are unemployed, people who are poor, that the system is rigged against them.
Well, I mean, how many people of working class background presently serve in the United States Senate? I think that question, it provides some insight into the phenomenon I was speaking of earlier. Income inequality and political influence are very closely related. Ask anybody who serves in public office what their number one, the bane of their existence is obviously the chase for money. They spend a lot of time doing that. Who do they talk to? They talk to the rich. Was this always the case? No, it was not always the case. If you go back to a period of, you know, a much more widespread popular democracy, you would find a much wider influence of trade unions, and other citizens' organizations, certainly churches, than is present today. So this is, I think, gets to the fundamental political question. Now, we can talk about the economic and social conditions, and there, I think there is a big distinction between the wealthy countries of the world, which created in the 20th century social insurance programs that put a floor under most people's living standards. And that project has been ongoing. I mean, further steps were taken under the George W. Bush administration when Medicare got a drug benefit, under the Obama administration with the Affordable Care Act. But the big progress was 20th century. It was Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the New Deal, and the Great Society programs. And in Europe in the post-war period, very similar sorts of institutions were created, sometimes better than ours. And those things do make a fundamental difference, putting, as I say, a floor under people's opportunities, under their basic basic living conditions and giving them a chance to participate more fully, to take more risks as economic actors.
I agree with much of what James said. I think the problem, though, again, is linking this problem of unequal opportunity to the kind of top slots in society, whether they're congressional positions or positions in business, linking that to income inequality. I think that's where the case falls apart. If you look across rich countries, it's interesting. Below the top 1%, there's not that much difference in inequality between the U.S. and for instance, continental Europe before you take redistribution into account, taxes and transfers. Continental Europe does a lot more of that than the United States does, but that seems to be something that is very culturally based. Folks in the United States are less concerned about income inequality, for instance, than people in Europe in surveys.
So you're saying in the United States that's just a perception, that the evidence doesn't bear out the fact that there may in reality be a very big difference in income?
Well, so there certainly is more inequality in the United States if you're looking at what I would call, the top 1% versus the bottom 99%. We do stand out there for sure. And we do stand out to some extent when you look at income inequality below the top 1% after redistribution has taken place, where we don't stand out that much. So if you just thought that the thing that's dangerous for society is for market incomes before we do any redistribution at all to be unequal. That's a case where below the top 1%, the United States actually doesn't look that much different, even from a place like Denmark.
A couple of key points. Income inequality in the United States has risen largely over the last 30 years because the very wealthiest hold a lot of capital assets, which have gone up in value, and that shows up on their tax returns as realized capital gains, dividends, and other capital-based earnings. You don't see that so much in Europe for two reasons. One, the capital markets aren't as important, and two, the tax system isn't as effective at recording the incomes of the very rich. For those reasons, it's very hard to make a clear comparison, factual comparison between the two regions. You also have the fact that the U.S. is one big country, Europe is a collection of much smaller countries, and if you factor in the inequality between countries, the picture is going to be different. So those things, I think, are matters that have to be really discussed very carefully. But then the question is, does the rise in inequality in the United States, which has occurred since the early 1980s, does it matter to the character of our society? My answer to that is unquestionably yes. I grew up in a society which saw itself and was fundamentally more rooted in middle-class values than is the case today. And that, I think, is a transparent, simple fact that everybody can understand.
Dr. Mincher?
But what I think is interesting is, as I said earlier, ideally we have this rich body of research that is making these connections between inequality and various problems that we care about, including democratic problems. But we don't have anything that kind of justifies that strong view that rising inequality has actually hurt democracy in the United States. And so what happens...
Well, firstly, you can see that there is inequality in the United States.
That's for sure, but there was inequality in the United States in 1965.
But the point that Dr. Galbraith was making was that it has grown at a much faster rate in the last 30 years.
Yep, that's absolutely true. But what we don't know is whether that's harmed our political outcomes at all.
I think you really have to have a fairly limited view of what counts as evidence, not to see that the concentration of wealth has created a money-oriented politics in this country. But with an extraordinary dominance, by the way, of the financial sector, which you can look at the history of the reaction to the Great Crisis, which, whether we're talking about the Bush administration or the Obama administration, was focused on saving the financial institutions with some vague theory that this would cause a revival of the economy. Well, the institutions were saved, the economy didn't revive, and one can clearly see which way the political actors were oriented at that time.
Okay, Dr. Mincher?
I think what's interesting, we're not talking about President Romney's failure to turn the economy around today, right? I mean, if Wall Street had a preference for a candidate, and certainly if you looked at where the contributions came from, then Mitt Romney would be president today. Barack Obama won in 2008 behind an unprecedented campaign of raising small donations.
That is also not entirely true, as you know well, that his largest contributors were in fact affiliated with Wall Street as well.
Sure, but isn't it also true that he amassed more small money donors than any presidential candidate in history?
I mean, I could mention names. We know that he was closely affiliated with Robert Rubin, a former Democratic Treasury Secretary with very, very good contacts in the financial community, a strong position there, and many, many others. His finance chair was from Goldman Sachs, and that gentleman went on to be the ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany. You know, I'm not saying this is just the way the American politics works, but to say that Obama ran an insurgent campaign against Wall Street interests would be very contrary to history.
Well, let's put it another way. So if we could reduce the top 1% income share in the United States back to what it was in 1980, I wonder, James, if you think that would improve our political institutions, our political processes versus how they are today. Do you think that there would be fewer millionaires in Congress? Do you think it would be less responsive to Wall Street?
Yeah, sure. And the way it would happen would be that wealth would be more evenly divided across the sectors and regions of the country, less concentrated, particularly in finance. And that would make an enormous difference to the politics of the country. Industry would be stronger, trade unions would be stronger, the service sector would be stronger. You need a country the country would have a better balance. That's what a greater degree of equality actually means. Right now, we're extraordinarily unbalanced, and that is because of the dominance of finance, which actually makes up the very large share of that very top income. As you know well, you're at the Manhattan Institute. You're at the epicenter of it.
Okay, I'm going to give you a minute to respond to that, and then we're going to have to take a break.
Well, I mean, I just think, again, this is sort of falling back on folk wisdom kind of conversations you could have on the street. Unions peaked in 1954. It's not as though unions started tanking in 1980 once President Reagan took office and inequality started rising. So I think it's connecting dots that may or may not connect.
All right, we are going to have to take a break right now. We'll be back with our guests and more of our conversation after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.